Welcome to the Probasco Podcast. I'm Claudia Williamson Kramer, the Probasco Chair at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and we're joined today by Professor Peter Boettke of George Mason University. He's the BB&T Professor for the Study of Capitalism and the Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for the Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at George Mason. And we're also joined today by Scott King, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga within the Probasco Chair. Thanks for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be here, Claudia.
So Pete's going to be given the annual Burkett Miller Distinguished Lecture this evening. So Pete, could you just tell us about the inspiration for your talk and what the main points you'd like to get across?
So I'm going to be talking about capitalism and socialism and our future, and it's mainly driven by the idea. I'll end with my lecture, which is to do a thought experiment. Imagine that you were a kid in college in 1979, which is when I was a freshman in college and learning economics. And what was your experience before you went to college? So say from the age of 14 to 18, what did you experience in the world that you just took as given? So in my time, right, what that was the end of the Vietnam War, the Nixon's impeachment and then resignation, the impeachment also of Spiro Agnew, right, was his vice president, the stagflation of the 1970s, sort of the rise of Saturday Night Live, which made fun of our political leaders, so we laughed at them. We thought of them as buffoons, Jimmy Carter jumping out of the rowboat because the bunny attacked him, appearing on TV in a cardigan sweater. And so you didn't view the government as like a solution to any of the world's problems and anything like that. And then I go to college and I learn about how the market system operates and how government sort of buffoonery gets in the way and screws things up. And that message seemed very easy to me to swallow and believe in and whatnot. But now fast forward to 2022 and your kid is a freshman in college, and what was their experience, right? So, to them, the collapse of communism is like a Charlie Chaplin film. It should be in black and white, and it's from last century, and they don't even know anything about it. But it's also it's sobering to realize that they weren't even around with 9/11, right? So 9/11 is not part of their lived memory, but the consequences of 9/11 are. So they remember the United States in being a permanent war economy. They remember that the economy suffered a great financial crisis when they were, in elementary school, probably. And then there was a big, long march against the whole issue having to do with, the 99, percent, the 1% kind of thing, and inequality debates. They've learned that, from various philosophers that have trickled down into their teaching that meritocracy is all rigged. The system's rigged. There's always a thumb on the scale for those who are of power and privilege. And so now you start trying to talk to them about the way markets operate, and it doesn't make sense. Oh, I forgot. And the biggest one is, that the world's going to end in 10 years because of environmental destruction and things like that. And so when you sit down and talk to them, they have different sets of presuppositions. As a result, one of the things that we've seen is a rise again of the popularity of socialism among young kids. It makes perfect sense that they would turn to all of that. And my question is, how do we as economic educators respond to that? Because in my own personal opinion, I think the economic science, and I want to emphasize that, economic science is like physics, and no sound, person practicing physics is not going to tell people that there isn't a law of gravity. Right. And so if they're about ready to jump off a cliff flapping their arms because someone told them, if you just try hard enough and you flap your arms, you'll fly to the moon. And you're like, no, that's not going to end well. And so to me, so many like commonsensical basic principles of Econ 101 are revealed every day as a consequence of these policies that have been followed that are wrong. For example, increasing minimum wages and then having capital substitute for labor. So, again, what you see is, animation coming in, right? And machines and, kiosks and stuff rather than the workers. And it's like, oh, how did that happen? So I hear the other day let's tax the robots now, these kind right. of, ideas. Well, as if like we didn't understand that capital will substitute from labor when we artificially raise the price of labor, right? Yeah. And economics should be more engaged in these conversations. And we have failed as an economics discipline in our task as educators. And so part of what I want to try to get across is the urgency of our task as economic educators to be the adults in the room and get us to talk about these difficult times and difficult social problems that we face, but give a more economically sound response to them rather than the emotional response that I think comes out of the sort of other side of things.
So then how is it that we do that? How do we engage in these conversations, especially in the current environment when it's so divisive, without people being dismissive as, oh, you're just a conservative or you're right-leaning or whatever they want to label economic educators as, because it's maybe butting up against their preconceived notions of what should or shouldn't be. So how do we engage in these conversations?
So, I mean, this is a big issue, and I'm not sure I have the answer to it. I certainly don't think I have the reach that's necessary, so I must be failing in communicating at some level, but I keep on banging at the door on it. I think that there's a preferred narrative, and people like to fit things into that preferred narrative. And so in many ways, the kind of message, going back to what I was saying, 1979 versus 2022, the message that we're trying to get across now is trying to open up an intellectual door that has been bolted shut and deadbolted and, welded tight, and we're trying to get open. Whereas in 1979, it was like pushing open a screen door, which is like, even Chevy Chase is making fun of the government, right? So why can't I, kind of not look to the government as my solution to our ills? And so I think we just have our work cut out for us. And I think the number one thing is to try to criticize with kindness, to emphasize the power of economic reasoning. I have a slide at the end of my presentation which goes over what I call the 4 pillars of economics, which are the truth and light of learning about scarcity and trade-offs. That is like the big shock thing that when you get that across to somebody and they first learn that, it's like that's where the real power comes in, the punch in between the eyes, kind of economics. But I think also we should teach the beauty and awe of spontaneous order. And I think we should teach the hope that entrepreneurial innovation, both at the level of products and at rules, can improve lives. And then I think we should focus on the idea that the improvements are most felt by the least advantaged in society, that modern economic growth and development has been fantastic, but it's really been fantastic for the poor because for the first time in human history in 2015, less than 10% of the world's population was living on less than $2 a day. That doesn't mean that all the problems of the world are solved, but it means, wow, like that's amazing. When I was in college, that number was more like 30 to 40% of the world was living in that kind of dire situation. It's what Nobel laureate Angus Deaton refers to as the great escape, right? Is that we've basically been able to escape this Malthusian trap of extreme poverty. I think we need to communicate that. I don't think many people know that, or it doesn't resonate with them, right? Like in a way that it should, I think. And so we have our work cut out for us to address these issues. And, so you worked with Bill Easterly at New York University. And last spring, I went to a conference on Easterly's new book that he's working on. It's called Saviors versus Skeptics. And it's the idea that if you go back in history, the justification for colonialism and whatnot was always given as we're saviors and we're going to bring the saving, institutions and grace to these populations that in fact are not worthy to be free, right? Because of a variety of reasons. They practice the wrong religion, they're not smart enough or whatever. And what Easterly counters that with the economists who are the skeptics, who argued that everyone has the right to be free. And his number one person is Adam Smith, right? So as Adam Smith did not defend colonialism, right? He was a critic of colonialism. Adam Smith did not defend slavery. He was a critic of slavery. And Adam Smith believed that everyone could benefit from having, property rights and freedom of contract and trade and all of this. And so this is what Easterly tries to document on all of that. But just even there, in a group of people that were very sympathetic to, Bill's basic message, there was still a marketing, quote unquote, a marketing problem. That is, does this message really, sell, right? Because what do we learn today? We learn from, a lot of the the new historians of capitalism and whatnot, that the reason why the West grew rich was because it exploited the non-Western nations because of colonialism, slavery, these other kind of things. And you line up all those hypotheses, and none of them explain the great economic growth, but yet people believe that preferred narrative because that's what's going on now. And so you run the risk when you try to counter that then you're blind to the atrocities of colonialism and slavery, which of course you're not. Because from the beginning, as an economist, you're against those things. And part of your reason why you're against them is because they're atrocious, right? Not just that they're not effective, or that they're atrocious human practices and we want to abolish them. But how do we get that message across? Because that's not what people think economists are arguing. And I think that's part of the message, too. I mean, that's an extreme drastic version of it, but you know that from your own work in development economics about how difficult it is to get people to look at basic facts of development. What is the consequences of economic growth for environmental quality, right? What is the consequences of economic growth for health and human welfare? They don't believe the result.
They don't believe the results. Yeah. And so that's an interesting puzzle that we as economists and educators face, is when we present evidence, whether it would be through, case studies, analytical narratives, large data, whatever, it points, all the different methods point to the direction of free enterprise and freer markets and property rights, leading to economic growth and development and helping the worse off. And when you present that and people still kind of refuse, what's next? What's left that we can do to break through that? I mean,
if I had an answer for that, I would be, thrilled, because I'm just amazed at the amount of this. There's been a rash of books that have come out trying to discredit a lot of market-oriented thinkers over the last several years. It's sort of a new genre of literature. And it's really not demonstrating their arguments are wrong. It's trying to impugn their character and their credentials, which is a kind of a weird strategy to do. It used to be that if you were in an intellectual debate with someone and someone did that, it meant you were winning because, so you can't defeat my ideas, so you try to do this. But nowadays, it's sort of all's fair game, right? And so one of the things that's really frustrating about that is a lot of these come out of history, right? Yeah. And they claim to be like deeply empirical at some level. But so Ira Katznelson wrote a book about the New Deal called Fear Itself, right, from Roosevelt's speech. I knew Ira Katznelson. He's a professor at Columbia. I knew him when I was in New York. I actually got along with him. I was part of some conferences with him and everything. And he writes this book. It's very, very good narrative history and, extremely, like archive driven. It's very good like that. But it's supposed to be this book about the New Deal and its interactions with economics. And there's no numbers. And this is weird for me to say, right, if anyone knows me as an economist. But it's like you're reading it and you're like, something's missing here, right? Like in order to understand why Milton Friedman might argue in the monetary history the way that he did, you only understand that if you actually look at the data. And you look at what's going on with monetary, the money supply and the relationship of prices and, and understanding, unemployment rates. There's something significant about Great Britain from 1920 to 1936 only having less than double-digit unemployment for 1 year, right? There's something significant about that as the given background. And if you don't have the numbers to understand and the policies to compare the effect of the policy with the outcomes rather than the intentions of the policies, right? Then I just go with the intentions. And all the book covers is the intentions. So FDR is a great success because he intended for the policies to actually be successful. But there's no real discussion about the sort of the depths of the recession in 37 or any of these things like that are talked about in there. And so you walk away from it if you're an economist and you have some affinity for like relationship between theory and data, however we talk about it. Yeah. You're like completely like, what's going on here? Like I thought I was going to get this deep historical analysis. And what I did was I got a deep historical analysis about what people thought they wanted to achieve, not whether or not what they thought corresponded with achieving.
And that's the whole point about economic analysis. It's like, given those means, given those ends, what's the effectiveness of those means to those, given ends? And that's all lost in this conversation. And in economics, that's our way of doing value freedom. So value freedom isn't that I submit my hypothesis to tests. The value freedom, that's people get confused about that because Friedman argued positive economics as you submit your hypothesis to test. But the actual way in which we get value freedom goes all the way back to Max Weber. And it's that I treat the ends as given. So you want to reduce unemployment by following this policy. Okay, I want to reduce unemployment too. Now, what is the means you're going to do that? I'm going to choose to have this, say, wage, policy. Oh, well, did that wage policy create that result on unemployment? Oh, no. Then that's a value-free analysis. That's not me, passing normative judgment on your ends or on your means, which we could do too, but that's a whole different thing. That's not doing economics. And so this is all lost in the conversation. And so getting people to buy back into, first of all, that economic science can be an adjudicator on these very hairy issues, I think is number one. And I think that's like a methodological, philosophical thing that has even in economics has kind of sailed, away. So we have a big battle to fight. Yeah.
So why do you think that has gotten lost? And so part of my thought process on this is the incentives within the academy. So economists that are at academic institutions do not have incentives to really engage with public discourse. And the incentive is to get a tenure-track job. You get tenure by writing journal articles that hopefully somebody reads them. If anybody's reading them, it's other academics. Yeah. And so we're kind of in this silo where we're just talking to each other and, patting each other on the back and saying you're doing great work. But if it's not getting out, and so not only if you don't have an incentive because you just, only have so much time, so you've got to do the academic work to get tenure. But then if you do start to engage in public discourse, you can be strongly discouraged to do that because it can sound political and maybe a message that your administrators don't like. And so, how do we balance? That's a real constraint. And then how do you balance that with what's the appropriate means of communicating to the public?
I mean, these are great questions and hard to answer. I was thinking, so I came upon this term about mainline economics versus mainstream economics because when I was teaching at New York University, the Institute for Humane Studies used me a lot for various things, myself and David Schmitz. David at that time was teaching at Yale. I was teaching at NYU. And so they kind of used the two of us as their young examples of people that were climbing through the academy. And so we'd have to go give these talks, all the different things. And kids would come up to me and they would say, well, you're not really mainstream economics, right? Like this. And I'd say, well, I don't really know what that means because I was taught by academic royalty. I said, my professor won the Nobel Prize. Another one of my professors was the second John Bates Clark Medal winner. And my third professor, he's a distinguished fellow of the AEA and a distinguished fellow of APSA. So I'm not quite sure what you're talking about here. I do understand that there's something different of what you're being taught, but I was taught by pretty important people. And so I building on one of those guys, Kenneth Boulding, who was the second John Bates Clark Medal winner, he makes this distinction between mainline economics. And so that's what I built on that kind of idea. But it was an attempt to respond to say that there is a science of economics that goes all the way back to Adam Smith and transfers all through these various, languages and historical context and whatnot. And it continues to evolve. And that's there's a certain core truth of that discipline. And my argument is that core truth is that we square the rational choice postulate with the invisible hand proposition, but via institutional analysis. And that too much of economics is done by just either collapsing the rationality hypothesis to the invisible hand, so they're one and the same, or denying that people are rational and therefore there is no invisible hand. And so in between that is you have people that are rational, but they're human choosers, and you have institutions that are as if history matters, but they mediate the way we interact with each other. And those institutions of law, politics, and society, they serve as the filter through which gives us
whether or not we get invisible hand outcomes or not. And so it's that focus. So if you look at all these economists from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill to, modern people like Jim Buchanan or F.A. Hayek, they all stress this idea of the importance of the intermediary institutions in being able to channel self-interested behavior into these public outcomes. Now, the fact that that is so divorced from the way that most people think about economics really raises a serious question for us. How do we get to recapture this basic wisdom of Adam Smith? There's a new book out right now called The Myth of the Market, or The Big Myth, and it's about the myth of the market. And one of the claims in there is about Stigler and Stigler reducing Adam Smith just to self-interest. So it's like as if Adam Smith is Gordon Gekko, right? Okay. Kind of thing. And greed works. And so it's Naomi Oreskes is the author, and she points to this particular volume that Stigler did. So I looked it up and read the introduction to it. And here's Stigler's big thing. He says, I'm going to write against the vulgar interpretation of Adam Smith, which actually is the idea that he's only about self-interest. And he says the key thing to understand about Adam Smith is he's seeking those social arrangements, this is his words, those social arrangements which allow us to funnel the self-interested behavior of individuals into this publicly desired outcome. But what's the key term there? The self-interested behavior is the given. That's like oxygen, right? The key term is the social arrangements. Yeah. But the whole critique of that she's offering, Naomi's Oreskes is offering, is that these people disregard the institutions and everything like that. And it's like, wow, like it's right there, like when you read it. So I don't know what it is they read. So how is it we get that? But that's also true of like Paul Samuelson would have said that, or Kenneth Arrow would have said that about the people. And the words are right there. And so you're like, wow, what's going on? Why are we having such a communication problem? And I think I don't know what the right answer is on that. And I think that we need to figure out the right answer there. Sorry, I'm a little long-winded.
No, that's great.
I'll tell you one last quip, though.
Please do.
It's a funny one about Boulding. So when I was a graduate student, Boulding was up there talking about how economics had transformed because of logical positivism. So I raised my hand and I said, Professor Boulding, how come in the 1950s everyone became a logical positivist? And he chuckled and he said, oh, my dear Peter, who would want to be an illogical negativist? And what he was trying to get across was that terms matter, right? And so the way you grab terms, they really do matter. So, this is why labeling someone a conservative is maybe a little different than labeling someone a liberal because, liberal means openness, all these kind of things. Where conservative means, closed and, not open to learning. Yeah, stagnant and all these things like that. And so, if people try to label economics, like, oh, that's that, conservative economics, that runs into a problem too because it's like pigeonholing you in a way that's not quite right. I mean, the free market guys were radical liberals, actually, and they wanted to open up the economy and have the power and privilege challenged by competition and whatnot. And so teaching that idea and sort of getting students to see the emancipatory power of markets. I did a podcast recently with Emily Chamley Wright, and she talked about her book, which was about female entrepreneurs in Africa. And one of the things that she said was she really was enlightened when she did her field work about how these women were not victims. They were authors of their own lives, and they were creating. Now, was their lives difficult? Yes. All the things down, you go down the list. Did they face all kinds of artificial barriers by the society? Yes. But what was their liberating tool? Was their entrepreneurship. That's what enabled them to overcome the oppressive social institutions that they were in and everything like that. And I think that's the message that we got to sell to young people. So, and it's not even like really selling. It's like, how do I communicate the science the best to people so that they see economics as a tool for the curious and unlocks, these mysteries in the world.
So I'm glad you mentioned the use of language and how words matter, because I did notice in your talk, you're using the words capitalism and socialism, and I still use them in class. That is how I teach. And I've been encouraged not to use those terms in academic papers. And editors have come back, can you switch to a different word instead of capitalism? And it's such a strange phenomenon to me because you can define it. It has a specific way in which we talk about it. And I find it to be important that we kind of take back the word, like liberal, for example. We now say classical liberal to mean what we mean,
liberal,
instead of what people think of liberal today. So why do you still use these terms, or how important is that endeavor in terms of owning the language, in terms of trying to communicate, when in some ways you do maybe lose some of your audience by immediately saying capitalism, because they start assuming
it's
certain
mercantilism,
things. Right?
Yeah.
Or you want greed, or you're a big business fan, or something like that.
So, at least in my scientific career, I have toyed with the idea of losing lots of different names that have connotations I don't like. One of them being the main paradigmatic framework within which I work in, which is called Austrian economics.
Okay.
In modern, modern economics, very few people that practice Austrian economics were ever in Austria.
Mm-hmm.
They certainly weren't educated at the University of Vienna. That's a historical phenomenon that goes back almost 100 years since the last time, people were doing that now. And so why keep the name? Mm-hmm. And the problem, I think, is that every other name is just a code word for that name anyway, right? So if you said, I do, say that we would have changed the journal Review of Austrian Economics to Spontaneous Order, which sort of makes sense given that public choice is like public choice. It's the concept rather than the name of the school. Mm-hmm. So they didn't call it Virginia Political Economy. They called it public choice. Why can't we just call ours, Spontaneous Order or whatever? Well, it's because everyone that ever hears that term says, that's like Hayek and Spontaneous Order, right? And so every word, subjectivism, right? Market process, any of those things will all of a sudden lead you quickly. Now, that maybe I just lack creativity in thinking about those things, but I have often thought about alternative names for a variety of things. And I understand the problem of crony capitalism, spot on. I mean, part of my message tonight is going to be about the increases in the amount of lobbying that takes place and why it is that affects the tacit presuppositions of the kids in the classroom, because that's what they know. Mm-hmm. So trying to maybe clarify that makes the difficulty of the communicating maybe at first more complicated. But once you get it right and understand that there is a market system which is grounded in the institutions of property, contract, and consent, and that is a different kind of beast than one that's grounded in rent-seeking and privilege granting and monopoly and, all the rest of stuff that goes on that, then people will understand, okay, I'm talking about something. And so one of my points in my talk is that you don't fix the dysfunction of government with more government, right? Yeah. And yet that is the world that we're in now. So reason why we have dysfunctions that are associated with market societies, the kind of inequalities, the macro instability, these kind of the injustice that's taking place, I would argue, and I think that we have good evidence to suggest, it's because of an over-involvement of the state in our economic lives and in our social lives. Too much of the thumb is on the scale. And so the answer to that is not to give them more power and the hope that they'll do better the next time. And so I want us to end this silly cycle of government grows because it fails, and it fails because it grows. And we just keep on feeding that. And I think this is how we get in the cycle that we're in. And so using terms like capitalism, socialism. The other thing is about socialism, let me address this because this is something that I think is really misunderstood by current socialists. And that is that they somehow think that the socialists of the 1920s and 1930s wanted Stalinism, right? Mm-hmm. So, it's like, let's all sign up for death camps and, and this is what they wanted. Actually, if you go back and read them, and I mean even read like the Bolsheviks, okay, not, they wanted a new world which ushered in an entirely, their rhetoric about what the future was is no different than the rhetoric of people today about, arguing for things. And their criticism of the existing system is actually no different than listening to Elizabeth Warren or anyone like that. All right, I'm not. So, Elizabeth Warren indicting, the capitalist firms and trying to blame them for inflation and, and all these things like that is no different than reading the people in the 1920s. I really wish that people would go back and read the British socialists that Hayek is responding to. So they read Lange and Lerner, those are technical economists. But I mean the Labor Party, people like that were, there's a great book by Elizabeth Durbin called The New Jerusalem. Her father, Evan Durbin, was actually a major developer of models of market socialism at LSE, but he was a Labor Party guy. And they wanted to usher in, or you read the Beveridge Report, and these kind of things, and then compare the rhetoric to today. Because their argument in the 1930s was, we are socialists in our economics because we are liberals in our politics. So we have to be socialists because it's the only way to save liberalism in our politics. And Hayek's warning to them was, that's exactly what the people in Germany were saying, and look what happened there. And guys, you don't understand that the reason why what happened there happened is because the socialist organizational form is inconsistent with a democratic way of life. It just, they're incompatible. They're incompatible with each other. And he tried to make that argument. Now, again, he doesn't make the kind of extreme slippery slope argument that people want him to make, that, if you take one step there, you're in the gulag or whatever. But he does give a warning, which means that if you follow consistently to the end, you will end up in that situation. And what we need to do is make sure that we understand the consequences of the incongruity between political liberalism and economic socialism and the interconnection there. And so to me, I think this debate is very important to wage, because today a lot of people are saying that some form of socialism will be an answer to whatever social ills that we have. And again, it's calling for state control of the economy, and that has consequences. And as I said earlier, we as economists are set up to explain the difference between intentions and results in policy. And so we have to bring that conversation back into very sharp focus so that people don't make claims that are empty. Sorry, Scott, I'm talking too much.
No, so I'm glad you brought up the discussion between Hayek and the socialists back in the 30s, because it seems to me a lot of the discussions we're having about liberalism and socialism today are similar to the ones Hayek was having in the past. So to me, it seems kind of curious that we're not quite rehashing the arguments Hayek made, but there are a lot of similarities between the way we talk about liberalism and socialism today as Hayek did. So do you think that knowledge of the discussions Hayek had with his interlocutors at the time, has this been lost or ignored by economics? And is there an issue with economics that we kind of seem to have forgotten these lessons or ideas that we've learned from figures like Hayek?
Yeah. So there's a recent podcast with Tyler Cowen and Brad DeLong. So Brad DeLong has this new book out. It's less than a year out now, but it's a huge book about the long 20th century. And in it, Hayek is kind of a foil for him. Right. That he beats up on, throughout.
That's right.
And Tyler corners him on it, and asks him. He says, "Look, when I read Hayek, Hayek isn't the caricature that you're having. And when I read DeLong before this book, he seemed to understand that about Hayek." And DeLong says, "Oh yeah, I know the subtle Hayek, right? But then there's this other Hayek,
right?"
And what he means by that, and he says, I'm using that Hayek as the hook, but it has nothing to do with the historical Hayek.
Right.
And I think this is a kind of very fascinating phenomena that's going on. Hayek is targeted that way, and you lose that whole history of what the men of science were actually arguing in the 1930s. Right. So part of the real benefit of the Caldwell first volume, Caldwell and Clausinger, biography on Hayek, which is Hayek a Life, and they've just covered the first 50 years roughly of his life, and now they'll cover in the second volume the second half of his life. But so they've gone up basically to 1950. All right, is where they're at now. I see. They're through his time at LSE. They're through his divorce. Yet his time at Chicago hasn't yet quite started yet. And that will be the second volume of what's going on. Mm-hmm. But so a lot of it is about the LSE.
Right.
Okay, and I think that whole chapter of economics is lost a lot, because what Robbins and Hayek did from 1930 roughly until 1950 is nothing less than spectacular in terms of economic, the kind of collection of minds, the students that went through there, and the sort of center of economics that they represented at that time. Now, at the end of that period of time, of course, they are overrun, like everyone was, by the Keynesian avalanche, right? And so the Keynesian revolution is this amazing phenomena, as Mark Blaug has put it. No phenomena in his memory of looking at economics where a whole profession switched its perspective within a decade, except for the Keynesian revolution. And that relates to some of the things that Claudia was talking about in terms of incentives that people have and the funding that was going on and everything like that. And the times, the emergencies of the time. Again, if you're in a deep recession, one of the things that's important to stress to students learning economics is that Keynes doesn't really give you a theory of unemployment. He begins in a world with unemployed resources, but then what he does is he gives you an answer out. All right. Whereas traditional economics begins with supply and demand, and you're in equilibrium in the labor market. And then there's a shock, and that shock causes the unemployment. And then there has to be a response, a snapback kind of effect, and to the response to the fact that now we have unemployment. And there has to be ways in which the wages sort of adjust or adapt so that we can be able to get back to equilibrium. That's a theory of unemployment. Right. Keynes just begins and then gives a theory out of unemployment. But that's what was needed at the time by people that wanted to do something, right? And so that's a very important aspect of all of these, can you provide an answer and a solution? So, to use a very extreme example today, which I think is a very hard lesson to get across to young students because they've been so educated in a certain way, is Matt Kahn, who was the department chairman at Johns Hopkins when he wrote the book, but now he's at USC, and he's a professor there. He's a Chicago price theory guy. He's very good. Yep. And he wrote a book by Yale. It's published by Yale. It's called Adapting to Climate Change. And what he does is he runs an intellectual horse race between mitigation policies and adaptation policies. So like what happens in countries when they try to adopt mitigation policies, say let's get to zero emissions, or we have adaptations. We allow, the price system to guide the allocation of resources and the movement of people, right, and whatnot. And he argues that in every instance that he's studied, that the adaptation policies are lower cost and more effective at really addressing climate change than mitigation, which are very high cost and also have lack of compliance and all kinds of other things that go with it. And so they're just very, very expensive policies to do, and they don't give us the same results. Like as he's pointed out, he points this out, and people call him a climate science denier. And he's like, no, I'm not. I'm actually beginning with the recognition that climate change is real. Yeah. Climate change is man-made. It's really a hairy problem. What's the best way to get us to address it? And to me, I think that we have to constantly be communicating these kind of ideas to get across. And so that's why recognizing that what were the terms of debate in the past matter, because those are in many ways still the same terms of debate today. But we don't recognize it. And so we somehow think that if you're learning from that previous debate, that somehow you're locking in the outcome of this debate rather than just informing this debate, then it's a big issue. So again, in the podcast that I listened to on my flight here with Naomi Arekis and Michael Shermer, one of the things that she does is she takes a swipe at people attacking socialism today as if like we all want to be Venezuela, right? And it's like, actually, I get what you're saying, but just why don't we go back a little bit? And I recognize when people actually held up Venezuela as the shining example, right? And now you don't want to hold it up as a shining example, but 10 years ago you did. Yep. Or, if you go all the way back to when I was a graduate student and we look at the Sandinistas and Ortega, and now we look at Ortega, and Ortega is one of the greatest thugs in Nicaragua, in all of Latin America. In fact, so much so that he has to retain power because he's afraid that as soon as he is out of power, what's going to happen to him is that he'll be killed, right? Because he's killed. And he's done all these things, but yet he was supposed to be the darling, right? And where did that come from? Is it that this is Hayek's road to serfdom kind of idea. It was like, did that transformation take place because of the institutions, or was he always like a thug kind of thing or something? And we have to understand these nuances of the interrelationship between that. So I think that, getting people to face up to the real consequences of socialist ideas. And I think one of the biggest ones, so this is not in my talk. It's totally kind of a little crazy hypothesis of mine.
The best kind of hypothesis.
But I think that we free market people, classical liberals, we screwed up in 1989.
Okay.
Because in 1989 we thought that we had now had the definitive proof that socialism had collapsed in front of us. The great social experiment had been revealed to be in all of its horrors, right? In terms of the butcher's bill, in terms of the death toll, in terms of economic deprivation, political tyranny, democide, all of that stuff, right? And so then the question became, well, how do I actually pull off successful reforms to get back to a market society? And a lot of our creative energy went into politics and not politics as such, but policy. Like, how do I get policy to work? And we stopped thinking about culture, and we ceded the cultural ground to those who we left behind, all the people in the humanities and everything like that, because economics. And so my good colleague David Levy likes to say, when economists leave history to the historians, right, we end up by, depending on the kindness of our enemies, right, to tell our story correctly, rather than actually for us to tell our own story about what's going on. And so I think we ceded that ground, and as a result, we've ended up by losing a lot of little battles that add up to a big challenge. One of them is meritocracy, the belief that somehow that young people striving and getting ahead is all a matter of luck, egalitarianism, rather than having any kind of merit to it, and that it should matter on merit. Now, you're a brilliant female economist. I would love to live in a world where I just said brilliant economist, right?
Yeah.
And you have in fact, seen like the dark side of the economics profession on all of that. But you also have persevered and overcome and, published all kinds of articles and everything like that to get ahead, right, in the economics profession, so that you're now the Probasco chair, right? Yes. And whatnot. And so I think that, yes, it's always difficult. It's difficult if you graduate from George Mason or West Virginia versus graduating from MIT or Harvard. It's difficult if you didn't go to, Amherst or Williams as an undergraduate before you went to Harvard or MIT, and all those kind of things, like networks matter, and we wish that they didn't, and they do, but at the same time, there is a sorting mechanism, that works at some level, and we test ourselves against that sorting mechanism. And any high achieving profession, whether it's dancing, music, or science, is going to have weeding out mechanisms which are brutal in a variety of ways. And so, but merit, so if you're the first violin of the New York Philharmonic, it's not because mommy and daddy got you there. Now, mommy and daddy did a lot of things. They sacrificed a lot for you to play the violin and all these things like that. But you got there because of your talent. And Michael Sandel telling us that that meritocracy is a bogus idea. I think that's filtered down into kids. I think kids' time horizon is short because they've been learning for a long time that it's only 10 years before the next aerosol can is going to light up Florida, right? And so what do you do with that? Like, how do they process and have that hope? So again, back to economics, I think one of the really great messages of economics is the work of Julian Simon, and that the ultimate resource is the human imagination. And so to me, like during the pandemic, one of my favorite books was Matt Ridley's book on how innovation works. And I love this line he has in the book. He says that innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity.
Oh, that's great.
It's a great line,
yeah, it's
right?
a great line.
And I he has a gift. I wish I had that gift of coming up with a term like that. So instead I quote him, right, on that. But it's just a captures in a nutshell. But I wholeheartedly kind of think that that's where, if we take like the logic of economics. So Chris Coyne and I have a paper about Simon, that we just published in the last year. It's called The Economic Logic Behind the Ultimate Resource. It tries to explain like why it is that claim about that the ultimate resource is the human imagination actually has a basis in economic logic. And so I would love to get that across to young people so that they see that, there's so many possibilities in the future that they're not imagining at the moment that could be, solve all our problems. So it's not like, I'm probably going to discredit myself right now, but like I'm sure Scott has heard this. You might have even heard it too in the past. But I always bust up because of the book, The Lorax. So one of the things that I had to do when I first started teaching was I was given a course to teach elementary school teachers economics. Okay. This is when I was a graduate student back in the 80s. And because the state of Virginia had passed a law that elementary school teachers and all elementary and primary teachers had to teach some economic content. Okay. So while they were getting their degrees, they had to take a course on how you might integrate economic content in here. And so I was always like, what the hell, how do I teach this to these people or whatever? And so I thought, Dr. Seuss, right? And so I said, okay, so let's talk about conservation principle. Because at that time, remember, like if you're reading Alchin and Allen, the conservation principle is all the way up in the front. That's a time discounting and why the interest rate is on that and everything like that. And it's like, okay, so let's the Lorax, so they're cutting down all those trees. So I'd ask the students, what do you think would happen to the price of trees as they kept on cutting them down? So the relative price would go up, which would then do what? Give an incentive for people to husband more rationally, the resource, right? But in the book, remember, there is no adjustment. They just keep doing the same thing. Right? And so they cut down the trees because they produce the snoods. The snoods, are the little consumer goods that the people all buy. And they end up by eliminating the trees, therefore destroying the whole forest. And so this is the whole deforestation debate and everything like that. But when we think about it in resource use, prices have this amazing role that they play in guiding us to rethink what it was that we're doing at the moment. And they're not taught that. And I don't know if they're taught that by many other economics professors. And so it's what are we doing wrong in our economics that they don't learn that principle? Why did Alchin have the conservation principle way up front in the beginning of the book? Is because that's how we manage trade-offs, right? And so how do we manage trade-offs? We live in a world of scarcity. We have to make trade-offs. In order for us to make those trade-offs, we need tools to the human imagination to be able to do it. What do those tools come to us as in a market economy? Property, resource ownership, prices, and profit and loss. So, yeah, I love, in this recent piece that you had with Pete on cheering for capitalism, you have a great summary of the calculation argument in there, and which goes exactly through this point about the role that prices play, the role that profit and losses play, and the role that property ownership plays. It's a really, really good depiction. I wish that a lot of economists, read that.
Thank you. So following up on one point in terms of you saying that this younger generation has more of a short-term horizon, I definitely think that is true in my students that I see, but also with the general public. I find that whenever we talk about public debt, for example, or even living currently in the positive inflation world that we're in, there is a somewhat of discounting that as a problem, and I think it's because they don't accurately, or maybe it's accurate, forecast the future, what that's actually going to do, or they can't imagine the loss of growth and the loss of prosperity because of our choices in terms of public debt today and inflation today. And to me, I do think that there is some of the shortening of your time horizon and a higher discount rate of the future. And I'm just curious, why did we think that happens? How do we start to combat against that?
Well, so I think that we have a little bit of a difficult empirical puzzle to tease out, which is that the 21st century has been a period in large part of pretty amazing technological developments. And so if we think of ourselves as doing the counterfactual, which is that we have let's say we have a total factor productivity curve. And that total factor productivity curve under technology 1 looks like this. And then under, I know I'm on a podcast, I just drew a line. But, and then we have a burst of trading opportunities and technology that gives us a different total factor productivity curve, which is much higher, but still faces the regular diminishing slope, right? And then what you do is have government stupidity thrown in, and you have, then deviations against your trend. It's still the case that as long as technology and trade are happening, so globalization era and technological innovations that are happening, the iPhone and everything else, you're going to have tomorrow's trough that's still going to be higher than today's peak. Yeah. And so you have a false view that you can put up with a lot of stupidity. In fact, you don't even recognize it as being stupid because tomorrow is richer than today. And the question is whether or not the way that Joel Mulcure puts this in a debate with Robert Gordon is tailwinds and headwinds. And that there's these headwinds of all these over-administration of the economy. And then there's tailwinds of innovation and entrepreneurship. And as long as the tailwinds are pushing stronger than the headwinds, the plane makes progress on its way back home. But if the headwinds get too strong, then all of a sudden that causes a problem. And I think that we have to ask ourselves whether or not the rate of technological improvement, whether the rate of trading opportunities is going to continue to expand. And with the rise of the new protectionism, right, and the new restrictions on things, that's one of the key components, which is now going the wrong direction. Yeah. We're increasing the headwinds. And if we start putting more and more restrictions so that we have to have permission-based innovation rather than permissionless-based innovation, we're going to put more headwinds on that too. And so, communicating to people about what is the consequences of a debt to GDP rate, which is unsustainable, or what's going on with the balance sheet of the Fed, and how do you have an exit strategy for those kind of things, or what's going on with this rent-seeking society, and we've gummed up the labor market such that it's now more difficult to get a job because it's more difficult to get fired from a job, right? That kind of weird interaction effect, and that's really gummed up our labor markets. That's all of those things can, if they become so overburdened and we don't have the offsetting trade and technological opportunities, then we'll start to really see, Now, the other thing about the United States is I do think that we are still a $1 trillion economy, 330 million people over, these time zones and tremendous we could clearly have 100 million more people come to the United States and we wouldn't be overcrowded, right? We have that kind of space or whatever. And so as a result, we are still a tremendous land of opportunity that attracts investment dollars. So we don't have a capital flight issue. When I was studying the former Soviet Union in the 1990s and early 2000s, they had capital flight. As soon as anyone got $1, they wanted to get it out of there as fast as possible because they had no trust in the institutions. We still have capital inflows. Foreign, investment is coming in here all the time. And that makes our economy very attractive to people. And so part of that attraction means that we are also able to hide some of our stupidity again.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so again, the counterfactual cuts against us. But it doesn't mean that the counterfactual isn't true. It's just that it takes a lot of teasing out. And because of that teasing out and people not having patience to work, this is an old Henry Hazlitt line, right? That working through the long chains of reasoning in economics is, not a simple task. Yeah. And it gets more complicated because in the middle of those, between the introduction of an act and the consequences of an act, we also have interest groups that are involved in all of this and confusing the message. And so that creates issues. So I think we just have to do a lot of subtle and, sorting out. So you asked me earlier about the communication thing. I guess that most of the time that I think of myself as having public engagement on social media or whatever, I don't really think about whether or not I'm persuading the person that I'm discussing the ideas with as much as whether or not a third party who's looking in would say that person's being reasonable or unreasonable. And I think the key thing is to try to always be the reasonable one in the room And that means that you have to always bring charity to the conversation and also this ability to see through different, windows. And then also, so in the volume that you and I are in to celebrate Peter Berger, my essay is more methodological than your and Pete's essay. And what I talk about is what makes a good social scientist. And I argue in there, it's important to note the word that I use, good.
Mm-hmm.
I said, because if you use great, that's too idiosyncratic, right? And so that in many ways, you can't really imitate, people
Mm-hmm.
like that. To just use an analogy real quick, when Michael Jordan became a famous basketball player, he returned to five-star basketball camp. He had just done a move in the NBA Finals, which you can look up. It's like this amazing move. He was up there. It looked like he twists and turns and holds himself up in the air for like forever. And all the kids, these are the best high school basketball players in the country. And they're all asking him to show him that move. And he turns to him and he says, does your hand cover 3/4 of a basketball? And he takes the ball and he holds it and it looks in his hand like a softball. It doesn't look like a basketball. It looks like a softball. And they're all like looking at him. And he goes, and do any of you have a 45-inch vertical jump? And they're like, maybe, but, I'm not sure about that one. He goes, yeah, you can't do the move unless you have both of those. So you better learn triple threat position and your basics,
Yeah.
And I think that this is the issue. So great social scientists, they have all kinds of unique skill sets. But good social science, and what I argue is that what makes a good social scientist is, one, to be able to look through different windows. And to be able to understand the perspective. So as an economist, you should be able to answer, how would a Keynesian answer this question? How would a monetarist answer this question? How would a new classical economist answer this question? How would an Austrian economist answer this question? Right? How would a Marxist economist answer these questions? You should be able to see through the different windows and be able to state the positions in a way that a Keynesian, a new classical, a Marxist, a monetarist would sit there and say, yeah, that's my position that I hold. And then you criticize it if you disagree with it, right? I had a kid in one of my classes where I was talking about this, and then he said that I violated the rules because I then criticized Marxism. And I said, no, dude, you're misunderstanding. I stated Marxism so that a Marxist would say, yeah, that's what I believe. And then I tried to show that Marxism was wrong. If I couldn't show that Marxism was wrong, I would be a Marxist. Right? So like, do you get the point? Like, and he still didn't get it. He was like, no, you can't criticize if you're going to state the position honestly. And I'm like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
But the point is to be able to see through the different set of eyeglasses of different theorists. So I think that's number one, see different perspectives. The second one is to be able to slide between different possible worlds. That is, you can imagine whatever economic perspective you take, then put yourself in different worlds, possible worlds. And so you put yourself in the depths of the Great Depression, right? And then you sort of, okay, then I put myself through a period of a boom period, right? So the roaring 20s or whatever. Or I then put myself in the dot-com bubble or whatever. And I put myself in these different, sliding through these different worlds that I find myself in. And I think it's this issue of seeing with different lenses and being able to slide between different possible worlds, that's what we do as social scientists. And so to me, economics is best practiced when we try to explain the variation and outcomes by variations in the institutions within which rational choosers engage in. Not that we have different people produce different outcomes, but same people, different rules produce different outcomes. That to me is like good social science because I'm identifying defining, causal root of the difference in performance in the different rules of the game under which people find themselves playing. That to me is what we try to do as economists. It's what Adam Smith tried to do. It's what, and I think that Adam Smith followed both of those things of being able to see the physiocrats, the mercantilists, in a way that they would recognize themselves in, but then he makes his own argument for his own position. And then he also sees it in all these different historical epics, way it plays out, and including an imagined world of a world of natural liberty, right? You know, that could exist, but doesn't exist at the moment, right? Or a free trade regime. And so to me, I think this is all part of what we have to get young people. And I think that, if I could sort of have one message to give to economics teachers when they go in to teach Econ 101 is that the very first thing they should do is tap into the natural curiosity of their student. So I have like this Robert Frank, idea of what he calls, the economic naturalist, kind of idea, just so that you kind of get people to think about like that we're trying to understand observations in the world and the pattern of curiosity that they get from like these unusual practices or whatever in the world. It's one of the reasons why I think, Pete's book, WTF, is actually like this amazing thing because it's extreme, right? So it takes extreme examples.
Yeah.
But what it shows is what seemingly nonsensical stuff actually has very deep roots in common sense about why they did what they did. And I think it teaches a powerful point about the economic lens by understanding that. And at the same time, I think, if you read my colleague Chris Coyne's works, I think that you learn a lot of following economics that relates to severe life and death situations. Yeah. So economics is both this very urgent thing and this wildly entertaining thing. And it's like the plane between those. If you can tap into young people and get them to see both of that, boy, you could get them to start thinking about economics and as a counter to some of these claims. But the criticisms are piling up. And it's not just from outside of economics. It's actually from within economics attacking basic economics. And I think that means that we have a very, very difficult task ahead of us.
So one more question kind of following up on and some of that is, if you think back to when you were just starting out, coming out of graduate school to now, are you more or less hopeful?
That's a great question. So my friend Dave Rachitko, we were like, thick as thieves, right, in grad school and the years, right after that. I always used to get upset that I didn't have like 100% conversion rate to economics majors. And I didn't understand it because I found the logic of economics so compelling. And Dave used to say to me, Pete, don't you understand we're the weird ones? And I would be like, what are you talking about? He says, we were the kids that not only sat in a principles of economics class and said, I like this, but we said, I want to spend the rest of my life talking about this. And I said, yeah. He goes, how many other kids did that? And I'm like, in my class? And it's like, yeah, nobody. Like, I was the only one, right, of my senior class that went on. I mean, younger kids did it, maybe one in every one of the classes, but it wasn't like 20 of them, did it or whatever. And he's like, yeah, you're the weird one, right? And I was like, no, that can't be true. I'm not weird, right? But so that was a hard thing to realize. It's, I had a very unusual trajectory my early part of my career because I really wanted to go and all I wanted to do was go back and teach in a small liberal arts college. That was my dream job. Okay. And I started writing my dissertation, and I fell in love with doing research. Now, I had a very active research graduate school career. I published quite a bit, and I had a very charmed graduate career because of that, because I published a paper in my very first year that was a symposium in a journal, and so it generated a bunch of citations. And so my professors really, looked out for me, and so graduate school was like, I was hired by George Mason my last year to be a professor. So I had my own office and everything. Like I was a visiting assistant professor, got benefits, all that stuff like that. So I had a lot of interviews with a lot of schools, some PhD schools and everything like that. And I was deciding like what I was going to do. And in the process of doing it, I was like, man, I really like research. So maybe I don't want to teach a 4-4 teaching load, And so maybe if I could find some place like that. And none of the PhD schools the first time out bit. I was ABD. I would finish in that first year that I was teaching, but I got a job at a research university, but like sort of that mid-level state university, like App State, like a school like that. Yeah. So not University of North Carolina, but like App State, and where you went first, and that's where I got my first teaching job. And I had a 2-2 teaching load, and and I just wrote, and I kept doing a very supportive faculty. There was 15 members in the department. They all were publishing. They were guys that published in like the Southern Economics Journal and Regional Science. They were all econometricians basically, okay. And so I was an outlier. One of the guys who ended up by teaching at University of Central Florida, that's where he went after teaching there. He became department chairman and was the one who hired John List,
Oh, wow.
And I gave him, he was really, really nice to me. And I was a junior faculty member, so he handed me one of his papers to read, a working paper. And I wrote comments and gave it to him. He really thanked me. He said, "Oh, these are really great. Thank you so much," or whatever. He says, "Do you have a paper that I could read for you?" So I handed him this paper, and he didn't say anything. And then he comes up to me a week later. He goes, he says, "I really liked reading your paper." He says, "I just don't know how to comment on it." And he says, "You don't have a model, and you're not running any regressions." And I said, "Yeah, but I'm trying to make a logical argument. I'm trying to match it with historical case, right?" He says, "Yeah, you're doing that." He says, "But I don't know how to assess that. I never read a paper like this." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Don't worry about it. Thanks a lot," or whatever. But they never told me not to do what I was doing and everything like that. But then, the dissertation ended up by, the world changed. So the Soviet Union collapsed. And, East and Central Europe collapses. This is 1988. In 1989, East and Central Europe collapses. My dissertation is all about that kind of stuff. And so I win the Omicron Delta Epsilon Award for top dissertation. I'm given this award at the AEA meetings and stuff, and blah, 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 And so next thing I know, I get the offer to go to NYU. I'm assistant professor at NYU. I moved there. 2 years later, I'm a finalist for a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. I'm offered a national fellowship at the Hoover Institution. When Hoover called me to tell me they offered me a national fellowship, I didn't know what Princeton had said yet. And so I said, "I can't tell you right now because I'm waiting on another thing. I'll let you know." Like when I think back at it now, I'm like, the person on the other end must have been like, "What's this guy doing? What are you doing?" Like that. Yeah. And so I was extremely optimistic, right?
Okay.
So this goes back. So my view is that my view was extremely bizarre because I basically thought my career was going to end up where I would go from either be at NYU and then be at, when I was going through the whole thing for Princeton, I got delusions of grandeur. I read this book on who got Einstein's chair, and, all these things like that. And I was like, "Oh my God, this is my future. Is I'm going to either be in All Souls or, the Institute for Advanced Study and, and Austrian economics." So when, the Review of Austrian Economics existed at the time. I didn't take over editorship until 1998, so I wasn't an editor yet, but it existed. But even then, and even when I became it, I still always thought, look, I want to be the editor of the RAE, but I actually want to flip the letters around. So it's the AER, right? But the AER is dominated. But the thought is that we would be the ones to control that. And I thought that was all in the agenda set. I thought that was, definitely a possible universe that you could slide into. So I'm a little disappointed that the world didn't go quite that way. I also thought that, the world in general had learned its lesson and that we wouldn't forget the lesson in some sense, and therefore we would not make the kind of mistakes that I think that we've made at some level to go back in certain directions. And so, but on the other hand, so that's those are external circumstances that I probably was delusional in the beginning to even think about the alternative way. I mean, I'm a kid from New Jersey who's a late bloomer who went to Grove City College and then got a PhD from George Mason University. The idea that I would be at the Institute for Advanced Study for the rest of my life or All Souls College, hanging out at the high table, is probably a little absurd, right? But anyway, I thought that at one time. But at the same time, I'm amazingly optimistic because since moving to George Mason in 1998, the number of students that I have interacted with who have become dedicated teachers of economics and solid research scholars that write articles that surprise and inform us is just so much greater than what we had before. And to be honest with you, one of the most amazing things about it is actually the number of women. When I was in graduate school, there was one woman in our whole cohort, right? Of that was it. Yeah. And now, it's probably overstating it, but I would say somewhere closer to 35 to 50% of our students are women that are in there, and they become, very great voices for economics, common sense economics, and teaching economics the right way, and I learn constantly from them, and so that's an amazing thing. I think that we've done a poor job of reaching out to other minority groups that I wish that we could do. I think it's a supply problem, not a messaging problem.
Yeah.
So, I wish that, we had, people that were involved in HBCUs, and teaching in those schools, like the way that, at Fayetteville State, we, had some people over the years. I would have hoped that we would have been able to, get like a student every year from one of those to then be in our PhD program or whatever. I've asked Tyler about that, and his view is that if you're a very smart minority student and really into economics, you would make much more money like going actually into the private sector. The idea of becoming an academic isn't that great of a return on your human capital compared to what your alternatives are. And so maybe that's the case that's going on, but I think it's a supply problem, and I think we should be addressing it in economics. So like when I read the flap that was caused about the crisis of economics, I don't disagree that there's a crisis in economics. I think we teach it the wrong way. We direct it to the wrong audience, all these things like that. I just have a totally different way that we would solve the problem than everyone else, right? I actually think the way you would do it is you reach back into high school and you would find high, performing students in high school. And then you would help mentor them through, college and everything like that. And then you work with them through graduate school and whatnot. I think it's a recruitment and identification and talent development issue. And that we should do that. And our economics profession should be open to that. And I think we could see the kind of positive changes that have happened with female students from the time I was a graduate student today that we could also find with minority students in that. And so, so people of color, I think, the world is open. The fascinating questions are, in fact, in many of their own, besides the minority students in the U.S., but internationally, many of the most troubling questions are still in various regions of the world. And I would like to invite all those people to be part of our conversation in economics. And I think we would have a better economics. We would learn more. We'd be more empirically rich. And, and our theoretical exercises would be more focused. So that's my hope. So I'm very optimistic because I think science is science enlists the creativity of individuals, and the creativity is unlimited in people. And so as long as we tap into that, I just want our profession to do that more. And that I hope, we can be change agents for. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Pete. That's excellent. I've enjoyed this time with you, and thanks to Scott. And this is the Probasco Podcast.